The clock on the courthouse wall showed 11:47 p.m. when Justice Robert Coleman finally walked out of the emergency meeting. His shoulders felt heavy after 3 hours of discussing a critical case that couldn't wait until morning. The parking lot was almost empty, just a few security lights casting long shadows across the concrete. Robert loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves as he walked toward his car. It had been one of those days that seemed to never end. His black sedan sat alone under a flickering light. Robert climbed in, started the engine, and began the 20-minute drive home to his quiet neighborhood. The streets were mostly empty at this hour, just the occasional late-night worker heading home or a delivery truck making its rounds. Robert turned on some soft jazz and tried to let the stress of the day melt away. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, he just wanted to get home to his wife and maybe catch a few minutes of the late-night news. The car started making a strange noise about 5 minutes from his house, a low rumbling sound that definitely wasn't normal. Robert frowned and turned down the radio to listen more carefully. The rumbling got louder, and then suddenly the engine made a terrible grinding noise and died completely. The power steering went out, and Robert had to wrestle the wheel to guide the car safely to the curb. He sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel. Of all the nights for this to happen. Robert pulled out his phone to call his wife, but saw he had no signal. The fancy neighborhood he'd broken down in apparently had a dead zone. He looked around at the huge houses with their perfect lawns and expensive cars in the driveways. Not exactly the kind of place where he could knock on a door at midnight asking to use a phone. Robert got out and popped the hood, even though he knew very little about cars. Steam rose from the engine, and he could smell something burning. Definitely not something he could fix himself. He walked around to the back of the car to see if he had any emergency supplies in the trunk. Maybe there was a flare or something that might help. That's when he heard the car doors slam behind him. "Hey, what are you doing there?" Robert turned around to see 2 police officers walking toward him. Both looked young and serious, their hands resting on their belts in that way cops do when they're ready for trouble. The shorter one, a thick-set guy with a mustache, was clearly the senior officer. His partner was tall and thin, probably new to the force based on how nervous he looked. "Good evening, officers," Robert said calmly, straightening up. "My car broke down. I was just checking to see if I had any emergency equipment." The senior officer, whose name tag read Peterson, looked at Robert with obvious suspicion. His eyes moved from Robert's casual clothes to the expensive car, then to the wealthy neighborhood around them. "This your car?" "Yes, sir, it is." Robert reached slowly into his jacket pocket. "I can show you my registration and—" "Keep your hands where I can see them," Peterson barked, his hand moving closer to his weapon. His partner, Officer Williams, immediately stepped to the side, creating distance between them. Robert raised his hands slowly. "I'm sorry. I was just reaching for my wallet to show you my identification." "What are you really doing here?" Peterson demanded, moving closer. "Little late to be wandering around this neighborhood, don't you think?" Robert felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He'd experienced this before, though not in many years. The assumptions, the suspicion, the way they looked at him like he didn't belong. "Officer, I live about 5 minutes from here. My car broke down and I was trying to figure out what to do about it." Williams spoke up for the first time. "You live around here? Where exactly?" "Maple Grove subdivision. My wife is probably wondering where I am right now." Robert kept his voice steady and respectful, even though frustration was building inside him. "I was coming home from work when my engine died." Peterson laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. "Work? At midnight? What kind of work keeps you out this late?" Robert hesitated for just a moment. In his experience, telling police officers that he was a judge sometimes made things better, but sometimes made them worse. Some cops respected the position, while others seemed to take it as a personal challenge. "I work at the courthouse downtown. We had an emergency meeting that ran late." "The courthouse," Williams repeated, glancing at his partner. "What do you do there, janitor?" The assumption hit Robert like a slap. Here he was, the Chief Justice of the state's highest court, being asked if he cleaned toilets for a living. He took a deep breath and chose his words carefully. I'm a judge, actually. Justice Robert Coleman. I was at an emergency judicial conference. Peterson's expression didn't change. Sure you are, and I'm the governor. Turn around and put your hands on the car. Officer, there's been a misunderstanding. If you'll just let me show you my identification. I said turn around. Peterson grabbed Robert's arm and spun him toward the car. Hands on the hood, feet apart. Robert's training kicked in. He'd seen enough cases to know that resisting, even verbally, could make things much worse. He placed his hands on the warm metal of the car hood and let them search him. Williams patted him down roughly while Peterson kept talking. Nice car, for a courthouse janitor, Peterson said. You steal this? Or maybe you're casing these houses, figuring out which ones to hit later. I already told you I'm a judge, Robert said quietly. My identification is in my wallet. My judicial ID is in my briefcase in the car. If you'll just look, we'll decide what to look at. Peterson cut him off. He pulled Robert's wallet from his jacket pocket and started going through it. Robert Coleman, he read aloud. This address, and that's not Maple Grove. We moved 6 months ago, Robert explained. I haven't updated my license yet. Peterson showed the license to Williams. Look at this guy, trying to run a game on us. Wrong address, claims he's a judge, expensive car he probably stole. Robert closed his eyes for a moment, fighting to stay calm. In his courtroom, he commanded respect from everyone who entered. Lawyers, other judges, even governors had sought his counsel. Now he was being treated like a common criminal by 2 officers who refused to listen to reason. Officers, please. Just call the courthouse. The security desk is staffed 24 hours. They can verify who I am. Stop talking, Peterson snapped. You're under arrest for suspicion of burglary and auto theft. Robert felt the cold metal of handcuffs clicking around his wrists. In the distance, he could see lights coming on in some of the houses. People were starting to notice the commotion. Soon there would be an audience to his humiliation. As they walked him toward the patrol car, Robert thought about the irony of the situation. Tomorrow morning, he would probably be reading cases about police misconduct and civil rights violations. Tonight he was living it. The back seat of the patrol car smelled like disinfectant and fear. Robert sat with his hands cuffed behind him, the metal digging into his wrists every time the car hit a bump. Peterson slammed the door hard enough to make the whole vehicle shake, then walked around to talk with his partner. Through the thick glass, Robert could hear their muffled voices but couldn't make out the words. He tried to shift into a more comfortable position, but the handcuffs made everything difficult. The plastic seat was designed to be cleaned easily, not for comfort. Robert had sentenced people who had sat in seats just like this one, but he'd never imagined what it actually felt like. The helplessness was the worst part. Not being able to use his hands, not being able to get out, not being able to make them listen to reason. Peterson got in the driver's seat and adjusted his rearview mirror so he could see Robert's face. Comfortable back there, Judge? He said with a nasty smile. Don't worry, we'll have you processed real quick. Officer Peterson, Robert said calmly. I understand you're doing your job, but this is a serious mistake. I am who I say I am. If you'll just make one phone call. Save it for someone who cares, Peterson cut him off. You think putting on a nice voice and using big words is going to help you? I've heard it all before. Williams climbed into the passenger seat and turned around to look at Robert. You know what I think? I think you were watching these houses, figuring out which family goes to bed early, which ones leave their garage doors open. That's how guys like you operate, right? Robert felt anger building in his chest, but he kept his voice level. Guys, like me? What exactly do you mean by that? Don't play dumb, Peterson said, starting the engine. We know your type. You dress nice, talk fancy, try to blend in with decent people. But we see right through it. The radio crackled to life and the dispatcher's voice filled the car. Peterson grabbed the microphone. Unit 47 to dispatch. We need a supervisor at our location. Also requesting backup for a suspected 459 in progress. Copy that. Unit 47. Supervisor and backup en route. Robert closed his eyes. A 459 was burglary. They were really going through with this. In a few minutes, more officers would arrive and this whole mess would get even more complicated. He thought about his wife at home, probably asleep, not knowing that her husband was sitting in the back of a police car being treated like a criminal. You know, Peterson continued, the funny thing is, you almost had me convinced for a minute. There, the judge story was creative. Most guys just claim they're doctors or lawyers. Because I am a judge, Robert said firmly. Justice Robert Coleman, Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. My appointment was confirmed 8 months ago. You can verify this with one phone call. Williams laughed. State Supreme Court. This guy's really committed to his story. What's next? You going to tell us you know the governor personally? As a matter of fact, I do. But that's not the point. The point is that you're violating my constitutional rights. You have no probable cause to arrest me. My car broke down, and instead of helping a citizen in distress, you've decided to harass me based on assumptions. Peterson's face hardened in the rearview mirror. Oh, here we go with the constitutional rights speech. You guys always think you know the law better than cops do. In this case, I do know the law better than you do, Robert replied. And what you're doing right now is going to cost the department a lawsuit they can't afford to lose. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of more car doors slamming. Through the window, Robert could see that backup had arrived. 2 more patrol cars, their red and blue lights painting the quiet neighborhood in flashing colors. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of. The situation was escalating instead of being resolved. But something else was happening too. Lights were coming on in houses up and down the street. Front doors were opening and people were stepping onto their porches to see what was going on. Some were holding phones, and Robert could see the telltale glow of camera screens. In today's world, everything got recorded. That could work in his favor, or it could make his humiliation even more public. Peterson got out to talk with the other officers, leaving Williams to watch Robert. The young officer kept turning around to stare at him like he was some kind of dangerous animal in a cage. You really think you're better than us, don't you? Williams said after a few minutes of silence. Robert met his gaze calmly. I don't think I'm better than anyone, Officer Williams. But I do think I deserve to be treated with basic human dignity, just like any other citizen would be. Any other citizen wouldn't be prowling around rich neighborhoods at midnight. Any other citizen might have car trouble and need help from the police instead of being automatically treated like a criminal. Robert leaned forward as much as the handcuffs would allow. Tell me something, Officer Williams. What exactly did you see me doing that was illegal? Williams shifted uncomfortably. You looked suspicious. I looked suspicious. Can you be more specific? Was I breaking into a house? Was I carrying burglary tools? Was I running away from something? You were messing around with a car that probably isn't yours. It is my car, and I was looking under the hood because the engine died. Is that illegal? Williams didn't answer. He turned back around and stared out the windshield instead. Robert could see the doubt creeping into the young officer's face, but it was too late for doubt. They'd already committed to their course of action. Outside, Peterson was talking animatedly with the other officers. Robert could see him pointing at the car, then at Robert, then at the houses around them. Whatever story Peterson was telling, it was getting bigger and more dramatic with each telling. One of the neighbors, an elderly man in a bathrobe, had walked closer to the scene. He was talking to one of the backup officers, asking questions and pointing at Robert in the patrol car. More people were coming outside now, drawn by the flashing lights and the unusual excitement in their quiet neighborhood. Robert recognized the look on their faces. It was the same look he'd seen in courtrooms when people couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Shock, curiosity, and a hint of fear. They were looking at him like he was the criminal Peterson claimed he was. A woman across the street was definitely recording everything with her phone. She held it up openly, not trying to hide what she was doing. Robert found himself hoping that video would somehow help him later, even though right now it felt like another layer of humiliation. Peterson came back to the car with a satisfied look on his face. Good news, he said as he got behind the wheel. We're going to take you down to the station and get this all sorted out. My supervisor wants to talk to you personally. Finally, Robert said with relief. Someone with sense. Oh, don't get too excited, Peterson replied. Supervisor Johnson doesn't like burglars any more than we do, especially ones who think they're smarter than cops. As they pulled away from the curb, Robert looked back at his broken-down car still sitting under the flickering streetlight. Tomorrow, this would all be over. Tomorrow, people would know the truth. But tonight, he was just another suspect in the back of a patrol car watching his reputation disappear in the rearview mirror. The police station parking lot was nearly empty when they pulled in. The building looked tired under the harsh fluorescent lights, like it had seen too many nights like this one. Robert had been inside this building before, but always through the front entrance, always as a respected visitor. Tonight, he was being brought in through the back door like any other suspect. Peterson parked near the booking entrance and turned off the engine. End of the line, Your Honor, he said mockingly. Time to see how real judges handle fake judges. Williams got out first and opened Robert's door. The night air felt cool after the stuffy patrol car, but Robert barely had time to appreciate it before Peterson grabbed his arm and started walking him toward the building. Easy, Robert said quietly. I'm not going to run. Just keep moving, Peterson replied, his grip tightening. Inside, the booking area buzzed with the usual late-night activity. A drunk man sat in the corner, arguing with himself about something only he could understand. Two other officers were processing a young woman who kept insisting she hadn't done anything wrong. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, looked up when they walked in. What have we got, Peterson? Suspected 459 caught him casing houses in the Willowbrook area. Claims he's some kind of judge. Peterson pushed Robert toward the desk. Guy's got a whole story worked out. The desk sergeant looked Robert up and down, taking in his wrinkled dress shirt and tired face. ID? Peterson handed over Robert's wallet. Address doesn't match where we found him. Car's probably stolen too. Robert watched the sergeant examine his driver's license. The man's expression didn't change, but Robert caught him glancing up with a slightly puzzled look. Something wasn't quite adding up for him either. Robert Coleman, the sergeant read aloud. Says here you work for the state. State Supreme Court, Robert said clearly. I'm Chief Justice Coleman. If you'll just call the courthouse security desk, they can verify my identity in about 30 seconds. The sergeant looked at Peterson. You run the car? Not yet. Figured we'd process him first, then check everything out. Run the car, the sergeant said flatly. It wasn't a suggestion. Peterson looked annoyed but walked over to a computer terminal. Robert felt a small surge of hope. Finally, someone was going to check the facts instead of just making assumptions. While Peterson typed, Robert heard footsteps coming down the hallway. Heavy, authoritative footsteps that belonged to someone used to being in charge. A moment later, a tall man in a crisp uniform walked into the booking area. The stripes on his sleeve marked him as a captain, and everyone in the room straightened up a little when they saw him. What's all the excitement about? The captain asked. His name tag read Martinez, and his voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of dealing with every kind of situation imaginable. Peterson brought in a burglary suspect, the desk sergeant explained. Guy claims he's a judge. Captain Martinez looked at Robert with professional interest. A judge? What kind of judge? State Supreme Court, Robert replied, meeting his gaze directly. Chief Justice Robert Coleman. I was driving home from an emergency conference when my car broke down. These officers assumed I was committing a crime. Something flickered in Martinez's eyes. He stepped closer, studying Robert's face more carefully. Coleman, he repeated slowly. Robert Coleman. Yes, sir. Martinez was quiet for a long moment. Robert could see the wheels turning in the captain's mind, pieces of information clicking together. In the background, Peterson was still pecking away at the computer keyboard, muttering under his breath about slow systems. Captain, Peterson called out. The car comes back clean, registered to a Robert Coleman at an address on Maple Grove Drive. Martinez turned toward the computer. What kind of car? 2024. BMW sedan. Black. And where exactly did you find Mr. Coleman? Peterson seemed confused by the question. About 6 blocks from the registered address. He was messing around with the car, acting suspicious. Acting suspicious how? Williams jumped in to support his partner. He was dressed casual, but the car was expensive. Didn't seem right. And when we questioned him, he got all defensive. Started talking about constitutional rights and demanding we call the courthouse. Martinez looked back at Robert. The courthouse. You said you were coming from an emergency conference? Yes, sir. Judge Henderson called it around 8:30. We had to review an urgent appeal that couldn't wait until morning. I didn't leave until almost midnight. Judge Henderson, Martinez repeated. Robert could see recognition dawning in the captain's face. Federal or state court? State. Judge Catherine Henderson. She sits on the appellate court. Martinez walked over to his desk and picked up a newspaper from earlier that day. He flipped through several pages, then stopped at what looked like the local news section. Robert couldn't see what he was reading, but the captain's expression was changing by the second. Peterson, Martinez said slowly, not looking up from the paper. Come here. Peterson walked over, still looking confident. Yes, sir? Martinez held up the newspaper, pointing to something on the page. Read this headline. Peterson's face went white as he read. Robert couldn't hear what he was saying, but he could see the officer's mouth moving silently, forming words he clearly didn't want to speak out loud. Read it out loud, Martinez ordered. Peterson's voice came out as barely a whisper. Chief Justice Coleman announces new criminal justice reform initiative. The booking area went completely silent. Even the drunk man in the corner stopped mumbling. Williams looked like he was going to be sick. The desk sergeant put down his pen and stared at Robert with new understanding. Martinez folded the newspaper carefully and set it on his desk. He walked back to Robert, his face grave. Justice Coleman, I am deeply sorry for this misunderstanding. Please allow me to remove those handcuffs immediately. Robert felt the metal click open and his hands were free for the first time in over an hour. He rubbed his wrists where the cuffs had left red marks, trying to get the circulation back. Thank you, Captain Martinez, Robert said quietly. Martinez turned to Peterson and Williams and his voice became hard as steel. My office, both of you, right now. Peterson tried to speak. Captain, we were just... Not another word. Office. Now. As the two officers walked away with their heads down, Martinez turned back to Robert. Justice Coleman, again, I cannot apologize enough for what happened tonight. This is completely unacceptable. Robert straightened his shirt and looked around the booking area. The other officers and suspects were all staring at him, finally understanding who had been sitting there in handcuffs. The young woman being processed whispered something to her arresting officer, who suddenly looked very uncomfortable. Captain, I appreciate your professionalism, Robert said, but we need to discuss how something like this could happen in the first place. Martinez nodded grimly. Yes, sir, we absolutely do. Can I offer you a ride home? And I'd like to arrange for your car to be towed and repaired at the department's expense. That won't be necessary, Robert replied. But I will need a report of everything that happened tonight, every detail. Of course. I'll have it ready by morning. As they walked toward the exit, Robert could hear the whispered conversation starting behind them. By tomorrow, everyone in the building would know what had happened. The story would spread through the police department, then to the media, then to the public. Robert stepped outside into the cool night air, finally free. But he knew this was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The phone call came at 6 in the morning. Peterson was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when his wife shook him awake. He hadn't slept at all. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Justice Coleman's calm face and heard Captain Martinez's angry voice echoing in his head. It's Captain Martinez, his wife whispered, holding out the phone. He sounds serious. Peterson took the phone with shaking hands. Hello, Captain. Peterson, you and Williams need to be in my office at 8 a.m. sharp. Don't be late. The line went dead. Peterson sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. His wife Linda sat beside him and rubbed his back. They'd been married for 12 years, and she'd never seen him like this. "What happened last night?" she asked gently. "You came home and went straight to bed without saying a word." Peterson looked at her. This woman who'd supported him through 15 years of police work, who'd worried every night when he was late coming home, who'd celebrated every promotion with him. How could he tell her that he'd probably just destroyed everything they'd built together? "I made a mistake," he said quietly. "A big one." An hour later, Peterson and Williams sat in Captain Martinez's office like two schoolboys waiting for punishment. The captain had barely spoken to them, just pointed at the chairs and continued reading through a thick file. The silence stretched on until Peterson couldn't stand it anymore. "Captain, about last night?" Martinez held up his hand for silence. He closed the file and looked at both officers with the coldest expression Peterson had ever seen. "Effective immediately. Both of you are suspended without pay pending a full investigation. You'll surrender your badges and weapons before you leave this building. Internal Affairs will be conducting interviews, and there will likely be a civil rights investigation as well." Williams spoke up for the first time. "Captain, we were just doing our job. We saw a suspicious person. You saw a black man in an expensive car and decided he must be a criminal." Martinez cut him off. "Don't try to dress it up as police work. I've read both your reports, and they're full of assumptions and prejudice." Peterson's stomach dropped. "Captain, I've been a good cop for 15 years. I've never had a complaint. Until now. And this isn't just any complaint. You arrested the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. Do you understand what that means? This is going to be on every news channel in the state. The department is going to be under investigation. Your actions last night could cost taxpayers millions of dollars." The room fell silent again. Peterson thought about his mortgage, his kids' college funds, his wife's medical bills. Without his salary, they'd lose everything within a few months. "What can we do?" Peterson asked desperately. "How can we fix this?" Martinez leaned back in his chair. "You can pray that Justice Coleman doesn't decide to sue the department and everyone involved. You can hope that he's more forgiving than he has any reason to be. And you can start looking for new jobs because your law enforcement careers are probably over." 2 days later, Peterson was sitting in his living room watching the news coverage of his mistake. Every channel was running the story. "Police arrest. Chief Justice" was the headline that kept appearing on the screen. Some channels had even found the cell phone video that one of the neighbors had taken. Peterson watched himself putting handcuffs on Justice Coleman and felt sick to his stomach. His phone rang constantly. Reporters wanted interviews. Friends called to ask if it was really him on TV. His mother called crying, asking how she was supposed to face her neighbors. But the call that broke his heart was from his daughter at college. "Dad, is it true? Did you really arrest an innocent man?" Peterson couldn't find words to answer her. His little girl, who'd always been so proud to tell people her father was a police officer, now sounded ashamed of him. That night, Peterson made a decision. He drove to the courthouse, hoping to catch Justice Coleman leaving work. He sat in the parking lot for 3 hours, but the justice never appeared. A security guard finally approached his car and asked him to leave. The next day, Peterson tried a different approach. He wrote a letter, pouring his heart out on paper. He wrote about his family, his 15 years of service, his genuine regret for what had happened. He wrote about how he'd never meant to hurt anyone, how he'd been trying to protect the neighborhood. He wrote until his hand cramped, then rewrote the letter 3 more times. Williams was dealing with his own crisis. Only 2 years out of the police academy, he'd already lost the career he'd dreamed about since childhood. His girlfriend had broken up with him after seeing the news coverage. His parents were devastated. His father, a retired Marine, had told him he was ashamed to have raised such a son. Williams decided to take a more direct approach. He found out where Justice Coleman lived and drove to his house. He sat in his car across the street for an hour, trying to work up the courage to knock on the door. Finally, he walked up to the front porch. Justice Coleman's wife answered the door. She was a small, elegant woman with kind eyes that turned cold when she recognized Williams from the news coverage. "Mrs. Coleman, I'm Officer Williams. I was one of the officers who..." "I know who you are," she said firmly. "What do you want?" "I need to speak with your husband. I need to apologize. I need to explain." "Explain what? How you humiliated my husband? How you treated him like a criminal? How you refused to listen when he told you who he was?" Williams felt tears starting to form in his eyes. "Please, Mrs. Coleman, I made a terrible mistake. I'm just 24 years old. I've never done anything like this before. If you'll just let me talk to him." "No," she said simply. "Robert doesn't want to see you. He doesn't want to see either of you. Please leave our property and don't come back." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Williams standing alone on the porch. Over the next week, both officers tried everything they could think of. Peterson's wife wrote her own letter to Mrs. Coleman, mother to mother, begging for understanding. Williams contacted his former police academy instructor, asking him to reach out to Justice Coleman on his behalf. Peterson's brother, who worked as a court clerk in another county, tried to use his connections to arrange a meeting. Nothing worked. Justice Coleman remained silent, unreachable, unmoved by their desperate attempts at contact. Peterson's union representative finally told him the truth he didn't want to hear. "Robert, you need to face reality. You arrested the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court based on nothing more than racial profiling. There's no coming back from that. The best thing you can do now is cooperate fully with the investigation and hope they don't file criminal charges." Williams received similar advice from his lawyer. "The justice holds all the cards here. If he wants to forgive you, he will. If he doesn't, nothing you do is going to change his mind. You need to prepare for the possibility that your police career is over." Both men spent their days waiting for phone calls that never came, hoping for some sign that Justice Coleman might show mercy. They checked the news, obsessively, looking for any hint about what the justice might be planning. They attended church more regularly, praying for forgiveness. They talked to their families about what would happen if they lost their jobs permanently. But Justice Coleman remained silent, and that silence felt heavier than any words could have been. 3 weeks after the incident, Justice Coleman sat in his chambers, reviewing a stack of letters that had arrived from across the state. Most were from citizens expressing outrage about what had happened to him. Some were from police officers apologizing for their colleagues' behavior. A few were from Peterson and Williams themselves, each letter more desperate than the last. He set the letters aside and picked up his phone. The call he was about to make would change everything. "Governor's office, this is Rachel speaking. This is Chief Justice Coleman. I need to schedule a meeting with the governor. It's about police reform." 2 days later, Coleman walked into the governor's office carrying a thick folder. Governor Thompson, a man he'd known for over a decade, stood up to greet him with obvious concern. "Robert, I've been meaning to call you. What happened to you was completely unacceptable. I want you to know that I support any action you want to take." Coleman sat down and opened his folder. "Thank you, Governor. But I'm not here to talk about personal justice. I'm here to talk about systemic change." For the next hour, Coleman laid out a comprehensive plan for police reform. Mandatory bias training for all officers, body cameras for every patrol car, new protocols for citizen interactions, independent oversight committees, community policing initiatives. The plan was detailed, thorough, and expensive. "This is impressive work, Robert," the governor said, flipping through the pages. "But it's going to face a lot of resistance from police unions and budget committees." Coleman leaned forward. "Governor, what happened to me happens to ordinary citizens every day. The only difference is that I have the power to do something about it. If we don't act now, we're telling every officer in this state that racial profiling is acceptable as long as you don't arrest someone famous." The governor nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "Your full support, public endorsement, and a commitment to push this through the legislature, even if it's politically difficult. You've got it." The following week, Coleman received a call from the local news station. They wanted him to appear on their evening program to discuss the incident. He'd been avoiding media interviews, but now he had a reason to speak publicly. The interview was scheduled for Thursday evening. Coleman spent the entire day preparing, not for questions about what had happened to him, but for questions about what needed to happen next. The studio lights were bright and hot, as Coleman sat across from news anchor Jennifer Walsh. She began, with the obvious questions about the night he was arrested, and Coleman answered them calmly and factually. Then she asked the question he'd been waiting for. "Justice Coleman, many people are calling for the officers involved to be fired and prosecuted. What's your position on that?" Coleman looked directly into the camera. "Jennifer, what happened, to me, was wrong. There's no question about that. But the real issue isn't what happens to two individual officers. The real issue is why this happened in the first place, and how we prevent it from happening again. So you're not seeking personal revenge? This isn't about revenge. It's about justice. And justice means changing a system that allows bias to influence police decisions. It means training officers to see citizens as individuals, not stereotypes. It means accountability at every level." Walsh leaned forward. "The officers have been trying to contact you. They've written letters, tried to meet with you personally. Don't you think they deserve a chance to apologize?" Coleman was quiet for a moment. "I'm sure Officers Peterson and Williams are sincere in their regret, but personal apologies don't change institutional problems. If I forgive them privately, does that help the next citizen who faces the same treatment? Does that reform police training? Does that create oversight mechanisms? So forgiveness isn't an option? Forgiveness is personal. Justice is institutional. I can forgive them in my heart while still insisting that they face the consequences of their actions. In fact, real accountability might be the most educational thing that could happen to them." The interview aired to massive public attention. Within hours, Coleman's phone was ringing with calls from legislators, civil rights organizations, police departments, and community groups. Everyone wanted to know more about his reform proposal. 2 weeks later, Coleman stood before a joint session of the state legislature. The gallery was packed with citizens, police officers, and reporters. Peterson and Williams sat in the back row, watching the man they'd arrested address the most powerful people in the state. "Members of the legislature," Coleman began. "3 weeks ago, I experienced firsthand what thousands of citizens experience every year. I was presumed guilty based on my appearance. I was treated as a threat rather than a citizen. My constitutional rights were ignored." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I'm not here to talk about what happened to me. I'm here to talk about what happens next. We have a choice. We can treat this as an isolated incident, punish a couple of officers, and move on. Or we can use this moment to create real, lasting change." For the next 30 minutes, Coleman outlined his reform package. He spoke about implicit bias training, community engagement, proper procedures for citizen contact, and accountability measures. He spoke with the authority of someone who'd seen the system from both sides, as a judge and as a suspect. "Some will say these reforms are expensive," Coleman concluded. "I say that the cost of not reforming is higher. Every wrongful arrest, every lawsuit, every citizen who loses trust in law enforcement, these things cost us more than training and oversight ever could." The applause was thunderous and sustained. Even some of the police officers in the gallery were clapping. In the back of the room, Peterson and Williams sat in stunned silence. They'd come hoping to hear Coleman call for mercy, for understanding, for a second chance. Instead, they'd heard him call for systematic change that would make officers like them obsolete. 3 months later, the reform bill passed the legislature with bipartisan support. The governor signed it in a public ceremony, with Coleman standing beside him. The new law required comprehensive bias training for all officers, established civilian oversight boards, and mandated body cameras for every police interaction. On the same day the bill was signed, Peterson and Williams received official notice that they were being terminated from the police force. The internal investigation had concluded that their actions constituted racial profiling and violation of civil rights. Both men were also facing federal charges. Peterson sat in his lawyer's office, reading the termination letter for the 3rd time. His lawyer, a kind man who'd been honest with him from the beginning, shook his head sadly. "I told you this was likely to happen, Robert. Justice Coleman made it clear that personal forgiveness wouldn't override institutional accountability. But I've learned from this," Peterson said desperately. "I could be a better officer. I could help train other officers not to make the same mistakes. Maybe, his lawyer replied. But not as a police officer. That part of your life is over. Williams received similar news. His lawyer explained that the federal charges could result in prison time and that his law enforcement career was permanently finished. He could have helped us, Williams said bitterly. If he'd just met with us, just listened to our apologies, maybe things would have been different. His lawyer shook his head. Son, you're missing the point. This was never about you and Peterson. This was about every person who might be in Justice Coleman's position in the future. He sacrificed your careers to protect theirs. 6 months later, Coleman stood before the State Bar Association to deliver the keynote address at their annual conference. The room was filled with judges, lawyers, and law enforcement officials from across the state. Justice, he said, looking out at the audience, is not about what feels good in the moment. It's not about personal forgiveness or individual mercy. Justice is about creating systems that treat all people fairly, regardless of their race, their income, or their social status. He paused, thinking about Peterson and Williams wherever they were now. Sometimes real justice requires us to let consequences unfold, even when it's painful. Sometimes the greatest mercy we can show is to ensure that others don't suffer. The same in justice. The reform law that bore Coleman's influence became a model for other states. Police departments across the country began adopting similar training programs. The number of racial profiling complaints dropped significantly, and in the end that was Justice Coleman's real victory. Not the personal vindication, but the knowledge that his experience had become a catalyst for lasting change.